Do you think it's a connection that if you're really good at the politics, you're an arsehole, and if you're not good at politics, you're a good person?
If no one is challenging decisions and making sure that you're learning from mistakes, you just keep going down blind alleys where the same things are going wrong over and over again.
I don't think great leaders are looking at job descriptions, and I don't think it's good for our younger generation to always associate success and performance with pay.
Or you're a traitor.
Yeah.
It's a great
Maybe
That is so
yeah.
true.
Maybe every boardroom, every leadership team should basically act like the traitors.
Yeah, do that game and see how you come out the other side.
You've got to write someone's name down, and you're like, Sarah, why did you do that?
I'm going to try and create this as a workshop. It's coming, it's coming. Hello and welcome to the Courageous Leaders podcast, brought to you by the Change Creators, where we strengthen leadership teams, creating environments where people and profits can grow together. I'm your host, Joanna Howes, and today we have a special Leadership Room 101 edition of the podcast. I've invited 3 incredible leaders to join me and discuss what leadership frustration they would like to see banished forever. They will each get their turn to share and pitch what their nominated frustration is, and then I will then decide which one out of the 3 will go into Leadership Room 101. So let me share with you the wonderful leaders we've got in the studio today. So on today's show, I am so excited. We have got the amazing Nishma Patel Robb, founder of Glittersphere and former head of brand at Google UK. Next up, we have Ete Davies, Dentsu's creative COO across EMEA. And then lastly, the wonderful Natalie Winford, Chief Solutions Officer at Jellyfish. And Nishma, I am very excited to start with you. What would you like to banish in Leadership Room 101?
There's probably loads of things I'd like to, but I have picked one particular one, which is probably surprising because the way I often kind of promote huge positivity, but actually it's toxic positivity. Which in quite simple terms, I think is when the cult of good vibes has gone corporate, which is basically that smiley-faced silencing of reality, where being relentlessly positive replaces being real, brave or authentic.
I think it's such a good one. And I actually recently saw someone in their values had always happy, always positive. And I'm like, you do know that could be quite dangerous, that you're just telling people they've always got to be positive. Have you experienced it yourself, and what impact did it have on you?
Yeah, both ways, both having been that person of being relentlessly positive, both at home and at work, and being corrected at both levels, and actually probably for quite a while not seeing it, but also being a victim of it. So that sense of going, but you should be really lucky, our team's really lucky compared to other teams, or celebrating grit of, the hard work without actually recognising there were problems. And that sense of feeling like you can't speak up, because if you do, you feel that you're ungrateful or you're being awkward, where you're just masking problems. And it wasn't until afterwards where I realised that kind of overt positivity was just a way of killing any feedback. So I think it's interesting when you realise your own style has been, you think you're doing the right thing by being really positive, but actually just silencing it. And then on the other side, feeling like a victim of it is you feel really bad yourself, because actually you then internalise problems and think, well, maybe it is me, and maybe I'm not being a team player in this way, or we should be grateful as a team. But it's a really difficult one.
It's time for it to go. Natalie, have you experienced this yourself?
I think I've seen it. I've seen it in certain leaders, and I think it's fake. And I think it's hard to be able to distinguish that, particularly if you're under pressure to deliver. As you said, do you call someone out? Do you just kind of get on with it? Do you feel like it's best that you just contribute to everyone else? And, ultimately it leads to pressure. And I think at a time where, particularly again for leadership, we've got to be as authentic and transparent as possible, or we know that's what really delivers. It's really hard. And I think as well, I think probably as you did, Nishma, it makes you go, okay, what's being hid here? Why are we feeling so pressured to constantly hide from it, I guess. But I mean, it takes a lot of hard work to either be on the other end of it, or I guess to perform it. I would question why you find yourself in that situation to have to do it all the time. It would be really hard work. So not a fan of it either.
No.
Are you a fan?
No, I'm
No.
not a
you
fan
would
of it either. I think there's something really interesting you both said around sort of squashing feedback or, voices of dissent or sort of challenge, which I think is really quite dangerous, not just for people's like individual psychological and mental well-being, but also for like the business performance. Because if no one is challenging decisions and making sure that you're learning from mistakes, you just keep going down blind alleys where the same things are going wrong over and over again. What's really interesting, I have a question actually for you, Nishma. Do you think that toxic positivity, particularly the pressure on leaders to have it, sort of like escalated during and post the pandemic? Because I've had similar. I've experienced being the sort of the victim of it, and tends to be, I find a lot, we've got like founder-led businesses, and they're sort of, their identity of the business is so strong that they don't want to hear anything that might damage that sort of fragile ego. But when I was a leader during the pandemic, there was a lot of pressure to sort of present this face and not actually confront the problems that, the challenges that the business was sort of having. And it became quite, you use the term mask, really hard to sort of sustain that. And you was almost sort of like frowned upon if you weren't presenting that. But I'm just curious, do you think that's...
I definitely think it exacerbated in the pandemic because there was that pressure to kind of, switch on your VC and go, hi, and everything's okay, even though probably people were facing burnout and other pressures. And interesting, actually, when I, in that period of time, was probably doing an element of that because we're all finding our way as leaders. But also when I showed that moment of vulnerability when I couldn't hold the mask any longer and I was like, just showed exactly how I felt to the team. It changed the dynamic on my team immeasurably. Like we came closer than we ever had been. But I think broader than that is, and this is the hard bit, is when it's intentional or not intentional. And I feel that when I was, subjected to that kind of environment, it was amazing that they would almost ignore some of the feedback scores, which were concerns around psychological safety, concerns around burnout. And it was always pushed to being something as like, well, I don't know how this could happen,
because we're being so positive.
I'm so positive. And we give everyone so much opportunity. And the burnout was almost, again, it's like, well, we've probably got the resourcing wrong, so it's interesting where I think that's when that positivity was used intentionally. Whereas I think in the pandemic, it might have been, there's a bit of leeway to go, we're all figuring it out. But I have definitely experienced it when it's quite intentional.
Do you think we need to train leaders to sort of be better at confronting negativity then? Like, do you think that's part of it?
Well, I think it's two things. I think showing when I was being really vulnerable with the team, and just was honest about what I couldn't cope with or what I was struggling with. And even on some of the big decisions or campaigns we were working or wherever the challenge might have been, it totally transformed the dynamic in the team. It was almost giving permission to others to talk about how they felt. I think the thing that we need to do better with training leaders is that seeking out the challenge and the negativity and paying more attention to those signals. And I liken this to, I think for me, the big wake-up call was actually with my son who wasn't very well, who had got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And I did the classic thing as a parent where I constantly go, it's fine, it's all going to be fine. And, there's technology that will help us and we'll do it. And it wasn't until a few months later where he stopped and he just said to me, can you stop being so positive, Mum? I just need to tell you how I feel. And I think that was a real wake-up call to me, was that my, sense of trying to be positive and smooth it over and give that sense that things were going to be great, even perhaps inside I wasn't feeling it, was I had just shut out any other noise. And I think as a leader, and particularly if I think about where it's not worked well for me in terms of being subjected to it, it's they were simply not listening or they didn't want to listen.
I think
and
it can
that's
keep you
the
safe.
training of listening harder.
Yeah, because I think that toxic positivity can keep you safe, like pretending that everything is okay. And it is quite interesting. There are more negative emotions that we experience as humans than there are positive ones. So they exist. And it's also to say that those emotions, anger and all things like that, they're not negative. It's just learning how to use them well. So I think that thing of, and also that whole thing of coming back to, we have a difficulty saying no. There's so many things we package them up as negative, but actually they can be really useful and really well, versus going, we've got to be happy and smiley and or we're all going forward as a team together.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really, really powerful one.
And I think it's also that piece around actually, as a leader, how do you balance that piece between moaning and constructive feedback on when it is negative. And I think that sometimes is an easy trap to fall in, because as the leader, it's not just actually how you're projecting your positivity, you're believing that you're trying to create that kind of overwhelmed sense of like, let's get into it, let's be positive. But actually it's really interesting, because I think it is a fine balance as a leader, because I've seen leaders who, unfortunately, their style encourages that moaning, and that's not helpful either.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because there's also the interpretation. So like, culturally, there's, even within the UK, but some cultures, people kind of moan, but it's sort of in the culture. You moan and you kind of, you sort of get on with it. Whereas others, and, particularly working with colleagues in the US, to your point, like moaning, even if it's like done in a humorous British way, it's seen as something really quite negative, or, just making a joke about the situation. But so it's so subjective. And
and it is hard when you've got business challenges as well. When I think as a leader, when are you honest and say this is a really challenging time? Everybody is going to get through this, and there's a difference from that positivity than actually already recognizing that it's going to be difficult. So giving everyone that safe space, which perhaps you didn't have, to be able to go, actually, if you're struggling with it. So I think there's that kind of supportive encouragement, which isn't that smiley positivity. It's quite a fine line, as you say, supportive encouragement for getting through a difficult time versus saying everything's going to be okay, it's going to be all right, and maybe using a different tone of voice where perhaps you're just ignoring and not really looking at it. I think that's the fine balance, because realistically, leaders are going to have to keep doing that, and you can't keep everyone happy all of the time. I think when it is that kind of toxic positivity, how much are you trying to sort of shove down people's throats versus realizing that that positivity actually should come from a good place, and it should be more authentic and real.
It's a really good point, because you've made a point there, and it's almost you can empower and give agency to everybody to actually help solve the challenges, or if you're too much on the toxic positivity, you're almost sort of pulling the wool over people's eyes, which actually doesn't help them to solve the realities that the business is facing.
I think naming it, as you say, getting up and saying, this is hard, or this is difficult, or this is, we need to look for this, but with that sense of vision or progress, or the willingness to kind of get involved and sort it out.
Yeah, which is different to just grit your teeth and smile. Everyone's looking at you.
But the thing is, you just think everyone just wants to feel seen and heard. That's all we want. We walk around with this billboard going, make me feel important. And if you can all feel you're having a hard time and we're trying to pretend that everything's okay, you don't feel seen, you don't feel heard. And then, as you said at the beginning, it makes you feel quite isolated. Well, is it just me that's finding this challenging? Because everyone else has got smiles on, and I'm finding it really difficult to bring my smile. So then it's very conflicting inside of you. And you said, I think you can feel quite isolated in that toxic positive culture. Ete, what do you want to banish in Leadership Room 101?
Similar to Nishma, I went through quite a lot of things, and I basically settled on something which I think sounds a bit existential and like amorphous, but it does have a very tangible impact on the day-to-day of leaders and the organization. And it is organizational politics. And I also have to caveat it that I'm not sure whether this is a cause or a symptom, of something else in the business. I think it's probably a bit of both. And I'm not talking about, I guess, sort of like stakeholder management, which is a natural part of any organization, or naive enough to say, well, where there's people, there isn't going to be some element of politics. I'm sort of talking about where you've got almost like an industrialized level of Machiavellian politics in the business. And everybody is very focused on internal perception and reputation, sort of territorial and sort of siloed behavior, not collaborating, but also not cooperating, where they've got like different individual objectives, and ultimately creates a really negative work environment for the team and the employees. Leadership role model behaviors, I think, are completely wrong in that sense, because you're sort of demonstrating the wrong values. And I think it really harms business performance, because suddenly everybody stops pointing at the thing that we should be doing, which is the work and the clients, and actually focuses on how are they jockeying and managing stuff sort of internally. And it's sort of earlier on in my career, I did have a sort of, I guess when you're sort of naive, right, and you get into it, this morbid fascination with people who seem to be quite good at navigating that and sort of escalating, until you actually realize that they don't contribute that much to the actual success of the business or the well-being of the team, or the sort of the real things we should place value at, but they're very good at managing the perception of them doing that, and it almost becomes 80% of their skill, which is a skill in and of itself. It's not one I think our industry should be encouraging. I don't have any answers to how we solve it, but it's a real challenge, because everyone becomes distracted on the internal jockeying rather than actually getting together collectively to do better things.
And do you think people can spot these people who are doing it quite easy? Or is it that clever?
I think
it's
there
quite
are
invisible?
some characters that are definitely overt, and people can spot them. I think within leaders we can probably more obviously recognize those people. I'm not sure people who are not in leadership positions or management can see that, because they don't get exposure to half of it, potentially. But there are also people who are very good at it, that they're not overt as well. Very covert individuals. Yeah.
And have you got a time? Has this had quite an impact on you personally?
Without sort of making it sound like I've had a sort of horrible career experience for the last 25 years, it's existed, I think, at some element in every organisation that I've worked in, to one level or the other. And I think how badly it has affected the business has really been down to how aware the leadership are of it, and how much they will want to role model the behavior, but also be really clear around things like strategy and sort of communication. If you're not, going back to the point around transparency and everything else, if everybody's not on the same page and they don't understand what matters in the business and what they're working towards, then people do start to just naturally go into, I would say, quite defensive positions, which breeds a bit of that in. It's also not all people. I think there's a certain amount within the corporations themselves, and I think sort of a consequence of how the sort of organizations work, their incentivization sometimes, I think, is not conducive, and it creates that challenge. And then also structures, whereby remits are not entirely clear, then that sort of creates that sort of situation, I think.
Little loopholes people can jump through.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Nishma, so you've been a leader for many years. Have you come across these characters?
Gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think it exists in every business. I think it's interesting. There's a number of things. I think you can tell when that kind of organisational politics sits as a parallel culture to a business culture, because it is its own thing. And you can arrive in a new business and you're a bit like, I don't really understand how things get done, and then you start to realise there's this parallel culture that exists. It's the kind of corridor decisions and corridor meetings, and I think in a matrixed organisation, it's easier to hide. It's easier to mask it, and actually there's kind of layers upon layers of different types of organisational politics. And I think you're right. I think some people are real careerists out of it and have done very well from it. And I don't know if they should be applauded or derised for it. You could probably look at it two different ways. But I actually think the performance management systems are one of the most significant parts to play in it. So of course leadership needs to take better responsibility for thinking about organisational politics, and I think too often it's actually senior leaders right at the top of the tree that set the tone and permission for those politics to exist, because they play them themselves. So they're almost demonstrating the way forward. But then I found that it's actually performance management systems, as you say, pit people against each other. So just weakness in ways that you're incentivizing and encouraging people to behave and act. And it's always that thing of saying, it used to frustrate me, because actually the behaviour that you want to have should be the thing that you incentivise people on. Totally. How do you want me to behave? But yet too often the language would say you want them to behave that way, but all of the mechanisms were very individually focused. And as soon as anything's individually focused, you are going, it's Hunger Games. And everyone's out for themselves and they're going to figure out their own way to do it. And I think that's where it becomes quite hard for leadership, even with the best will, because you're then fighting an established system. And that's, I think, it's really dangerous, and I think some people will say, well, politics exists in every business and that's just how you get things done. But I think it's when you don't point to it and acknowledge it. You don't point to the fact that there is this parallel culture that exists. I remember a time where we it was so prevalent that the corridor meetings were where decisions were made, you know, and it became a point of like, what's the point of being in a room and doing all the work if actually it's just out there that's going to happen? Yeah. And there became a point of, you know, everyone banning those corridor meetings, and they worked for a while, and actually things were really good. And a lot of the effort was around how do you collaborate, how do you cooperate, you know, how do you move from that kind of competitive box over. But it's then how quickly it seeps out, and that's where I mean about, you know, the senior leadership have got to hold the line on this. They cannot, doesn't matter what happens, ever break, because as soon as there's that one break, flood straight through again.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the problem, because I work with senior leadership teams a lot. They're normally the main culprits, or someone on the leadership. That's how they've got onto the leadership, by playing those politics. And I like, I can never say his last name properly, Patrick Lencioni. They say his work, the book, The Advantage, you know, talking about you're either a working group or you're a team, and that collective mindset. And the fundamental thing that I see that doesn't exist when you start seeing these politics come in is trust. The minute there's not trust, or you think you could get front stabbed or back stabbed by one of your colleagues. And I think there's a lovely analogy. You think as people go up to a leadership team, you run your departments. So you've been encouraged to be quite individual going up, like head of this, head of that, protect your department, look after your department. Then you join a leadership team, and suddenly you're told you've actually now got to work together and align together and make decisions for the whole, not just your department anymore. And I think that shift is actually quite difficult for people to suddenly go, actually, can I trust these people around the room to have my best interests at heart as well as the company's? Just a quick reminder, if you haven't already, to please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It's a small action that makes a big difference. You'll be the first to know when new episodes drop, and your support helps us create meaningful content for leaders like you. I'd also love to hear from you, so if you have any thoughts, questions or ideas, pop them into the comments. And if you're curious about how my leadership coaching or training could support you or your team, just drop me a DM and we'll set up a call. Thanks so much. Now let's get back to the episode. Have you ever found yourself in that position where you've needed to play the politics a bit yourself?
Well, it's one of the, I guess, leadership advices. If somebody says to me, give me some advice on leadership, probably one of the first things I say is learn how to get along with people you disagree with. I think that's like fundamentally one of the things that you've got to be able to do. I'm not saying it's right, and I don't think that any of us should be in roles or agencies where it feels like we're having to play a chess game. And I can't remember his name, but I watched a podcast, this brilliant guy, and said, you know, you really can't have within your organisation high-performing arseholes. Like, they will end up ruining the high performers that aren't arseholes. And I think it is a leadership thing. And I think within that team, I think there's a perception that if you're at a boardroom table that it's like family and everyone should get on, and in reality it's not that. And I think it's each individual that decides how much they want to give of themselves to succeed. I think with regards to ineffective people, which I think as well forms that kind of, you know, you talked about it, you know, are they playing the game in order to get, you know, into a certain position? I think you've just got to call it out, and it depends whether, you know, you have a CEO or somebody that's going to listen to you and respect that, or you have the ability to change it. And I guess sometimes you just don't, unfortunately. So it's hard, and I think you've got to decide the environment that you want to be in. I wish it wasn't there either. And I think sometimes businesses get really lucky and you end up with individuals, and if you can find those like-minded people, that's where the success comes from. And, you know, the organisational side of it, I think, you know, strength in numbers, I guess, is what I would say.
But it is also that you get that, which is a bit like the toxic positivity. Just as you said it, I was like, it's the amount of times when you've been there and they go, we're just like a family.
Oh God.
You know, and the family thing is the thing that masks it. That's the worst thing in the world. And actually, families are probably more political than anything else.
Absolutely.
Are there any place, you know, trying to offer, I suppose, a bit of a solution or a thought in it, where I've seen active work to try and break some of those politics? And I think it's hard because there's always sort of multiple systems working. But, you know, that point at the top is being part of a team where we were, to your point, when you come in and it's like, you know, leave your job title and your department at the door, and you do that, and that's quite a hard shift to make, because inevitably everyone reverts back immediately to, it's all great when you're talking about office space and stuff like that. As soon as it gets into any like real like salaries and bonuses, everyone's like straight in, protect my team. is we weren't allowed to look at the resourcing and the performance reviews of our own team. We had to assume a different role around the table. You literally walked in and going, right, you're given this, and you had to spend time really understanding. Well, it was a great way to learn about different parts of the business and the drivers behind the decision making. And it was a great way to kind of cross-check leadership. But it was done genuinely in a collaborative way because you wanted to make somebody else understand your world so they could make great decisions, and you had a genuine interest and more empathy for someone else. So that's probably one of the best places I've seen to break that. But it requires, I think it's also it's almost like particularly people coming in to a business actually as well. It's like, what's the tone you set for new joiners to go, this is how decisions get made, or this is how things get done, or this is how you progress, rather than leaving it to people to figure out.
It's such an interesting point, because I've worked in an environment where you use the term parallel culture, which I think is spot on, and I wish I'd actually thought about that when I was thinking of how to frame it. But I've worked in an environment where there was a bit of that, but it wasn't seeping through, as you said. And then we made one senior hire who came in from an environment that was quite political, and literally within months the dynamic in the leadership structure changes, and it just showed you how quickly that sort of barrier can break through if the leadership don't hold the line. I think there's some really good points that you sort of both made around family and stakeholder. I'm always a little bit wary as well of the thing family, because families are like dysfunctional, and actually I think a community is a better way to look at a business, because people then there's a shared set of values that people have opted in to be a part of, and sort of like work towards it. I think when we talk about performance management, which you've made, and sort of incentives and getting along with people naturally that you might have a different opinion of, or you don't sort of wouldn't necessarily work with based on personality types, or there's some sort of social tension there. One thing I don't think we're very good at with leaders in not just our industry, but I think across the corporate spectrum, is developing behaviors and incentives that are both focused on building cooperation and collaboration, and obviously collaborating towards a shared business goal. But by nature of some complexity, people are individually focused on particular areas or incentives or teams, and the dots need to be connected by the senior leaders as to how two different individual objectives work in benefit of each other. And I don't think that happens enough, which then means everybody goes into a zero-sum game of like, oh, it's all or nothing for me, rather than realizing, you have your individual objective, but you also can benefit from helping someone else with their individual objective as well.
Do you think it's a connection that if you're really good at the politics, you're an arsehole, and if you're not good at politics, you're a good person?
So I have met and worked with a few people who I think are good people in the sense of, in integrity and work with good intentions, that have been able to navigate the politics. In my experience, and it's just a survey of one, they've always tended to be quite reluctant politicians, if you know what I mean. Again, with your point around parallel culture, a bit of this is just how it works, and I will navigate this in the best interests of everybody. I think the arsehole, to your point, there's people who actually relish that situation. And that is quite a unique individual that I think is generally quite dangerous to have in your business. So I think it is possible to sort of be a nice person, so to speak, and know you have to kind of navigate it, but I'm not sure those people particularly enjoy it.
Before we move on to the next one, it just made me think. I was brought up by my mum telling me you need to learn to play the game. And I was, I think I'm a generally nice person, but that is what I heard all the way growing. You've got to learn to play the game. And I don't know if that was a baby boomer, actually, and I don't know if that's still filtering through to the other generations, but that's what I was told I had to do. And it's like, I've just got to play the game then. And it was accepted that was the norm. So I think it is quite interesting of like how generations have influenced other generations of how you think you have to enter the workplace in the first place.
And maybe it's just a reality. Actually, maybe it is.
That is just what you have to do.
You do have to play the game. It's just how you choose to play it.
I think that's it. It's how you play it.
Play it with integrity and kindness and all the rest of it, but you have to play it.
Or you're a traitor.
It's a great
thing. That is so true.
Maybe every boardroom, every leadership team should basically act like the traitors.
Do that game and see how you come out the other side.
You've got to write someone's name down, and you're like, Sarah Sarah, why did you do that?
I'm going to try and create this as a workshop. It's coming. Thank you so much, Ete. Natalie, I'd love to know, what would you like to banish?
Okay, so I would like to banish evasion. And one phrase in particular, from a leadership point of view, is I don't like the phrase, it's above my pay grade. I think it drives the wrong culture. And, you know, just to be clear, again, I'm not talking about the CEO, but I think within leadership, if you have had, if you have responsibility and you have a team, and, you know, I like to see the leaders feel like they can affect that, and I don't think they should avoid it. I think, you know, we're in a difficult time, right, in our industry. Has everybody had a pay rise? Have, you know, people been given huge bonuses? No. So just to be clear, if you feel like you are delivering above and beyond the level of your current job role, then absolutely go and talk to your line manager, say, look, I think we should look at this. I think that's different from being in a team environment and saying, actually, I'm not going to do that. That's above my pay grade. And I think it just drives a culture of avoidance. And I think, again, if you're a leader, I do think you should be able to have the ability to lean in. And I don't think great leaders are looking at job descriptions. And I don't think it's good for our younger generation to always associate success and performance with pay. I think, you know, we've got to work so hard, because that's not necessarily coming easy at a time where our industry, you know, clients have got less budgets. We know things are changing. You know, how do we make sure that the younger generation feel like they can be rewarded in ways which isn't actually, can I check my job description? I'm not paid to do that, so I'm not going to do it. So it's a personal pet hate. I mean, I had a few things as well, because if somebody says that to me, and I actually haven't heard it for a long time, but I really want to go, why would you say that? Yeah. Why would you say that? You know, do you not like this job? Do you only want to do this job to a certain level? You know, because at the moment we're trying to encourage a growth mindset and ask everybody to go above and beyond, not in a toxic positivity way, you know, in a way where we can actually try and enable that to have growth, so we can have a successful business, and so people can have pay rises and we can release bonuses. So it's just a pet hate. And I think I've just heard it more and more and more. And I think it is a post-pandemic thing. And I think it comes from, you know, perhaps, again, hybrid working, people clock off at a certain time, you know, is that where it's being revisited as, this is my job, this is what I get paid, this is what I'm going to give. Oh, no, sorry, that's above my pay grade, I'm not going to do it. So
I'm also curious if it's always related to pay, because it is quite a passive-aggressive term to say it's above my pay grade, especially depending on the tone, or it's just above, like, you can't expect me to do this, or I'm not willing to do this, or I don't want to do this, or I'm actually quite scared to do that, so that I'm just going to give you a passive-aggressive response so I can get myself out of this, because I don't know how to do it.
But I think if somebody said, oh, I'm not sure about that, or should I be doing that, or should somebody else be doing that, great.
So that's a resourceful way.
Let's have a conversation. Great, but a response of, I'm not doing that, that's above my pay grade, it's got a tone to it, which feels like it's...
What's interesting, and I wonder also if this is some of the context, is if someone's being asked to do something, then it's probably because it's in their capability or their experience to do. So the interesting thing about that phrase is you can help, but you're actively choosing not to, because there is maybe some other, like, there's either a disconnection or some other sort of bargaining chip that you have. You know, you sort of mentioned it earlier on as sort of like a thing that seems to be happening more prevalent post-pandemic. And it does feel that, like, there was a change in the sort of invisible contract, not the one that you sign, but like, you know, between the organization and the individual, which I don't think anyone really stopped to sort of address properly and go, okay, what do we need to modify, or what do we need to sort of reset back to? And there is just like a drift that's happening with people's attitudes, and I think on both sides as well, you know, between the business and employees, and employees and the business and their team, which is resulting probably in some of that, I think.
Interesting you say that. We literally just revisited job descriptions at the beginning of this year, just to realign, because, you know, having honest conversations, like when people say, oh, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, great, you're doing your job. Brilliant. There's your job description. That's great. Let's have a conversation about something else. And I think when was the last time anybody necessarily looked at that? And, you know, perhaps if you've recently had a new job, that was part of your recruitment process. But what if you've been in the business for 5 years, it's changed within that time, your role has changed, your client set has changed. You know, has anyone actually sat down with you and made sure that there's clarity on that? So yeah, I think revisiting some of those things and just making sure, and you know, I guess it's just nice, isn't it? I think if you do want to grow and evolve and you get given some things that somebody sees you have the potential to be able to deliver on, that you could do, it would be great if you took it. And I think if you don't feel comfortable, you've got to have the environment. Just don't make it about your pay and don't make it about grade.
But I think there's a bit of an attitude there, isn't it? It's the attitude of the person. What's your thoughts on this?
I mean, it's such an interesting the way you phrased it, actually, because when you first said it, I thought about it as, I've seen it very often at leadership, just to evade responsibility.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, oh, well, I can't deal with that problem. It's above my pay grade.
Yeah.
You know, it's not wanting to take responsibility or accountability for something that maybe they don't have in their gift to solve, but to push it back in that way is complete evasion. And I do think that's a problem. I think that, inevitably there are things that individual leaders can't solve.
Yeah.
But I think to bat it away in that way always felt really poor.
Yeah.
I think it's way more important to say, look, I can't solve this individually, but I'm going to go and find out who can, or this is the process, whatever. I think it's a very poor statement and that's again, it's that silencing thing. I think as an individual, it's interesting because I think there has been such a broken contract that, you know, and that's both sides. So from pandemic, it definitely set a new kind of setting of the way that we work and how we work. But also, to your point, we haven't shifted back. You know, it's 5 years since
so
we went
long.
to the pandemic. And we have transferred so much of that working style. You know, so people still complain about way too many meetings like they used to have when you're in the pandemic, or what the purpose of it, those blurred lines when people were stepping in and helping each other. So I suppose I see it from both sides. I see regularly people frustrated with saying, hold on, I did all this and I've had no reward, whether that's pay, promotion, progression, whatever it might be. And so that's frustrating to think, hold on, I did all this and I got nothing at the end of it. So there becomes a bit of, well, I'm going to set my barriers and my boundaries, so I'm not going to overstep that. And I think from an expectation point of view of businesses and leaders, there's also been a challenge where it's a case of saying, but, you know, hold on, you were doing that before, now you're not willing to.
Yeah.
And I hear you, particularly when resources are tight and you're going, well, I can't reward you with more money, so what else can I do? I feel for me that it's two ways. I think there is definitely, it's an easy way to get out, but I think it sends a bigger message.
Yeah. If
someone says, I'm not doing it because it's above my pay grade, is they've probably got an issue with the way that things are graded. And often it's more than that than the pay. And I think this sense of progression more than anything else has really frustrated people. You know, I know personally, and I've talked to lots of other people as part of the Glittersphere and otherwise, is how many people feel so stuck.
Oh gosh,
And when you feel so stuck, I think that sense of going, well, I'm not going to do any more than that now. And that becomes really frustrating. So I almost think that if people are saying that, it's digging into like why.
Yeah,
are
red
you saying
flag
that
as
more?
well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then as a business, what more can be done to outside of pay? What are the other rewards? And I think that progression and learning. And I actually think your point about job descriptions is so true. Because businesses don't, and they do change. You know, it's so rare you go in and you do one thing. And like one of the things we did latterly when I was at Google, I know it's a system they now have now, is we evolved to a process of performance management which was all around expectations. So, you know, we always had these OKRs, but to make those OKRs more personal, knowing that job descriptions were shifting. That's just a reality. I think in an AI world, they are shifting more and more so now anyway. It was almost decoupling it to say, okay, this is broadly the family of jobs that you sit in, and there's some kind of overarching sense of this is what you do and this is what's on your broad job description. But then more specifically, you had a set of expectations and you'd write those with your manager. And those expectations very much like, you know, what am I going to do and deliver in this period of time? You know, what does good look like, etc. So there's a real sense of how to do it. I think that was great. I think the failing is that when you do that and then there isn't something at the end of it, that's when it all falls apart. And I think obviously they're still correcting some of those systems, but I think it's that. And sometimes when you have these really broad categories of saying, well, if you do this, you're going to fall into this, you know, literally performance grade, not your leveling. Is people go, well, hold on, I could do that amount of work and get there. or I could bust a gut and I'm still hitting the top of that band and it means no different. Why aren't I going to coast? And I think it's those kind of, that motivation that's a real challenge, because it is frustrating. I think we probably all have generations where you just lent in and you did as much as you possibly did. And I used to say to people, rightly or wrongly, you got promoted by doing the job you were going into for ages before you did it. And I used to find it amazing that people go, well, I'm not doing that until I get promoted. And I was like, what? I did it for years. But then you kind of sometimes go, hold on, who had this wrong?
Was it?
And I don't know, if honest. I don't know if I had it wrong or if they had it wrong, because I think it's probably a bit of both. There's a willingness to do and show and demonstrate, but there is also kind of like, don't take the piss. I think some businesses have taken the piss.
And younger generations are so much better at setting those boundaries. We know that. So, you want to be able to celebrate that, but you want to get the tone right and the professionalism right in being able to express, I guess, when those boundaries have been broken, or again, like I said, if you can clearly identify, and also how you build those relationships with people from a leadership point of view, perhaps when you do spend the majority of your time online with them versus being in office and having that, in real life culture. All of that stuff leads to perception, doesn't it, of individuals and how you kind of nurture them through that journey. We have found the job description, the relaunching of them really helpful. I think it's really helped a load of people, and also just given people a platform to go, okay, fine, I am really clear. This is what I do for the business, and actually here are some goals that I'm going to move to. And, it's less, performance process, more about, job evolution. And I think that's better.
Yeah, it's a way to sort of re-engage the employees, because too often employee engagement, I think, just falls into the survey, tell us how you're feeling, when actually where people want to be engaged is where they feel they're contributing value in their day-to-day and their sort of experience. And a lot of that will come through asking people how they want to do their job differently, or where they think they should be doing it, as opposed to just evaluating their performance against the job description, which they haven't really been involved in consulting or sort of crafting. So I think there's a really sort of interesting point there on how you can use that to re-motivate actually people who are sort of a bit disengaged. I think it's really interesting that you said around the wording as well, and like what it means to sort of dig into it, because on the face of it, you can think, okay, right, let's have a conversation then about like recognition and sort of celebration and progression outside of salary. Or is that code for it's very hard to execute positive change in this business, or there's sort of complexity in it? And as you said, it's like, if you hear that as a leader, the next question should be like, what do you mean? Do you know what I mean?
Let's get clarity. And I think from listening to all of you, the two things that are coming up for me is people seek clarity, and then this is also a coaching opportunity. As soon as someone says that, you're like, there's something wrong here. Let's actually coach this and find out, what do you mean, what's going on? Let's look at what's set to give more clarity.
And also that sense of value. I always found that that was one of the key things, is that if people weren't clear about what their contribution or their value was in a business, is that that human need to feel valued and have some degree of contribution or purpose around what you're doing. I think when that erodes or is unclear, to your point around the clarity, I think that also causes an issue.
You start feeling that frustration.
What do I do? What am I valued for?
On that note, we are going to need to now go to closing statements. So you ready? You've literally got top line closing statements for me to make my decision which one is going to go into Leadership Room 101. And I will start with yourself, Nishma.
So I would love to see those masking statements to go into Room 101, the Leadership Room 101. And I'd love to see real leadership kind of step up. The ones that, as we said, this is hard. Let's acknowledge it and recognise that things might not be okay. And that's the kind of positivity we need.
Nice, thank you. Ete, over to you.
Yeah, so I'd love to see the organisational politics, or the parallel culture, as Nishma put it, going into Room 101, because it actually detracts from the core focus of the business, creates a horrible environment for employees, and just breeds the wrong type of leaders.
Yeah, really nice. And Natalie?
I would like to banish evasion in Leadership Room 101 and change the terminology used of it's above my pay grade, and recognise that could be a red flag to have to dig into individuals, work out what they're giving. Do we need to look at the culture? And I think it should never be said ever again.
Nice. This is actually a challenging one because I'm a bit torn because my brain's going, if I eliminate that, could it help remove the other two? So I'm trying to think what's the bigger picture. And I'm going to go with my instinct, although I keep batting back. I am going to go with toxic positivity. The reason why I'm going is I'm thinking if we could get rid of toxic positivity, we could actually maybe remove some of the office politics because people would feel more comfortable saying that's not on. We need to talk about it. Let's stop pretending everything's okay or this behaviour is okay. And I actually think those would eliminate the pay grade issue because the culture would be more better when we could deal with these negative situations better because people could say, do you know, I'm not feeling okay being asked to do that versus needing to say that's above my pay grade.
Very nice. You've connected them all together.
I was trying to think if I solved that, would it go there? So Nishma, thank you. Toxic positivity is going in today's Leadership Room 101. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you all so much. That was such an interesting conversation, and my brain's now ticking with ideas, especially how to do a traitors workshop with leadership teams on there.
We'll be there.
But thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everyone for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next week. If you've been enjoying the Courageous Leaders podcast, we'd love it if you'd subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us keep creating quality content and reaching more leaders like you who are ready to grow and make a real impact. We fund this podcast ourselves, so every subscription truly makes a difference and allows us to support courageous leaders like you. Thank you for being part of the journey.